Well, good morning to this continuation of our Franciscan spirituality series. And it's day 3 of this, and it's the 15th of April. Today, I want to get in touch with a real core aspect of the Franciscan way of life. And I know I've spoken in the last two about this over sentimentalizing of Francis, and that he was sort of just some god hippie running around trying to save the world. However, the reality of all that is that actually Francis was known as God's troubadour. And what's a troubadour? A troubadour is one that goes around singing love songs and writing poems about their love and all this sort of thing. So there is an aspect of Franciscan spirituality that is the lover, the one who can't help themselves but extend this idea of love of the beloved. So Francis would often spontaneously burst out into song and poetry, expressing his love and his joy for being within the love of God. And in the third order of Franciscans within the Anglican expression, we have what's called 3 notes, and these are marks that things that mark the lives of tertiaries, or tertiaries aspire to have them mark our lives. We are human and we don't always live up to the aspirations we set ourselves, and they are humility, love, and joy. And it's when these 3 characteristics are working within the lives of a Franciscan, then the work we do is fruitful. And when they're absent, the work is probably less fruitful. So a life of the Franciscan ought to be characterized by a real joy for life and for all God's creatures and for God. A joy that goes beyond sheer happiness. Happiness is circumstantial, yet joy is something that runs really deep, and despite our circumstances, as Francis showed in his life, despite being cast out and in immense poverty and freezing at times in the cold weather without a roof over your head, you can still know joy. And it's that pure joy that is a mark of Franciscan spirituality. Obviously, other spiritual disciplines and practices and ways of life will experience that too, but it is a distinct characteristic of Franciscan spirituality that there's this real joy. Francis being God's troubadour, it is like those early throes of love when you've fallen in love and you can't help yourself, but every word that comes from your lips and everything is about your beloved, the one that you've fallen in love with. And that's what marks the Franciscan way of life, is that we can't help but speak and sing and write poems and be exuberant in our love towards God. And as a result of that love can't be contained. It flows then into the love for other people and for creation as a whole. And that's sort of the basis of Franciscan expression. This joy, this love, this exuberant love that is so clearly defined in Franciscan spirituality, as it says in the mirror of perfection, intoxicated by love and compassion for Christ. Blessed Francis sometimes used to act in ways like these. For the sweetest of spiritual melodies would often well up within him and found expression in French melodies. And then murmurs of God's voice, heard by him alone, would joyfully pour forth in his French tongue. Sometimes he would pick up a stick and from the ground and lay it on his left arm. He would draw another stick across it with his right hand like a bow, as if he were playing the viol or some other instrument. He would imitate the movements of a musician and sing in French of the Lord Jesus Christ. But all of this jollity would end in tears, and with joy would melt away in compassion for the sufferings of Christ. And at such times he would break into constant sighs, and in his grief would forget that he was holding what he was holding in his hands, and be caught up into the spirit into heaven. And there you see in Francis's life and in the life of Franciscan spirituality that out of the joy and exuberance of being within the love of Christ and knowing the love of Christ brings a deep compassion and love for his world, and an engagement with the suffering of Christ, which then gives you an engagement with the suffering of other people. Because Christ's suffering is the suffering that goes beyond the great suffering, as I mentioned previously. And that once we engage with Christ's suffering, our own suffering and the suffering of others becomes a natural course as to which we flow. And there's this deep compassion that flows from that. So it's this interesting mix that the actual joy that notes Franciscan spirituality is also the very thing that will lead us to tears, will lead us to great deep sorrows and sighs for the state of the world. So it's not separate from the world. It's not like you're living in a fantasy land where everything is roses. No, it will lead us to know that there are thorns as well, and that it will lead us into a deeper compassion and love for the hurts of this world and for the hurts of people and creation. So as we go from this moment of Franciscan spirituality, know the joy of being loved by Christ and loving Christ in return. And in the deeper you go into that joy, the deeper you go into that love, the more able we are to love ourselves and each other. And that even despite our circumstances, joy will remain even in the harshest of conditions. Even in the midst of our sorrow and suffering, joy can exist. And it's that joy that enables us and gives us the strength to engage with Christ's suffering and with the suffering of this world and with each other's suffering.